My name is Ryan Endicott. I'm a former U.S. Marine infantryman, and I served in Ramadi, Iraq in 2005. I joined the Marines in 2004 because, like some people here tonight, and like tens of thousands of veterans across the country, I had very little options after finishing high school. I had no money for a higher education, health care, and I lived paycheck to paycheck, struggling to pay rent, utilities, gas, food, and all the other costs of surviving on a minimum wage job, unloading freight from ships for 50+ hours a week. The Marines represented an honorable way out of my living conditions. I could stand up and fight for my country, help people around the world, and be a part of something bigger than myself. What I realized from my experience in Iraq is that regardless of what my intentions of joining the military were, my role in the military was to do exactly what I did: to invade, terrorize, and occupy the country of Iraq, to kill and possibly die fighting any and every Iraqi who stood up and fought back, so that Wall Street bankers, oil tycoons, and weapons contractors could turn super profits. Whether it's the Marines in Iraq, the Army in Afghanistan, the drone bombs in Pakistan, Somalia, or Libya, the role of U.S. military remains the same: a tool for the U.S. war machine, a tool for the capitalist imperialism. We must be clear about this fact. Whether the U.S. under Republican Bush administration proclaiming that the U.S. will spread democracy in Iraq and Afghanistan, or whether it's the liberal Democratic administration of Obama declaring his intentions to spread democracy in Libya, the U.S. war machine will always serve only Wall Street. And this, sisters and brothers, is because capitalism, as an institution, and all state apparatus, including the police, the courts, and the U.S. military, has only and will only serve Wall Street. This undeniable fact must be explained in a time when mainstream media outlets, President Obama, and NATO allies are patriotically proclaiming a victory for the people of Libya. We must understand that the only people that have secured a victory with U.S. and NATO intervention in Libya live nowhere near the impoverished people of Libya, but right here in the U.S., along with the imperialist European allies and counterparts. Libya contains, quote, 47 billion barrels of oil reserves. The 74th largest economy by gross domestic product, possesses 3.4% of the world's known supply. In normal times, oil and gas account for 95% of exports and 80% of government revenues, end quote, according to Business Week. Furthermore, prior to the U.S. and NATO imperialist intervention, Libya was producing 1.6 million barrels of oil per day. At the time of the intervention, the oil was nationalized, providing millions of Libyans with health care, housing, along with numerous other social services. In 2007, in an article which appeared in the African Executive magazine, it was noted that Libya, quote, unlike other oil-producing countries such as Nigeria and Saudi Arabia, utilized the revenue of its oil to develop its country. The standard of living of people of Libya is one of the highest in Africa, falling into the category of countries with a gross national product per capita between 2,200 and 6,000. End quote. This is all the more remarkable when we consider that in 1951, Libya was officially the poorest country in the world. According to World Bank, the per capita was less than $50 a year. According to the Encyclopedia of Nations, quote, the living standards of Libyans have improved significantly since the 1970s, ranking the country among the highest in Africa. Urbanization, development projects have enabled the Libyan government to elevate its people's living standards. The social and economic status of women and children has particularly improved. Various subsidies of free services, health, education, housing, and basic food stamps have ensured basic necessities. The low percentage of people without access to safe water is 3%, health services 0%, and sanitation 2%, and a relatively high life expectancy, 70.2 years. In 1998, indicate the improved living standards. Adequate health care and subsidized foodstuffs have sharply reduced infant mortality, from 105 per 1,000 live births in 1970 to 20 per 1,000 live births in 1998. End quote. Now this, sisters and brothers, is a picture of Libya, of free Libya, I should say, according to mainstream media. It's a small picture of what Libya looks like now in comparison to what it looked before US NATO planes and drones began carpet bombing their country, all the while claiming that it was in the interest of the people of Libya. And now, after US and NATO forces have finished dropping bomb after bomb to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, after US and NATO, CIA, and international intelligence agencies trained, funded, and armed extreme right-wing Islamist rebel forces to go town to town, murdering men, women, and children who courageously fought against imperial forces, after thousands of people were beaten and brutally lynched based on the color of their skin, now, according to the mainstream media and the Obama administration, the US government, Libya is free. Quote, "They treated us like animals who didn't deserve protection," proclaimed Abu Abdul Rahman, a resident of Sirte. Quote, is this what they call a revolution?" he asked as he sat in his home, devastated by rebel forces. Another resident of Sirte, who still proudly hung the green flag supporting Gaddafi, stated, quote, "We lived with Gaddafi for 42 years. He never attacked our houses with his army," end quote. He said this as he sat in his demolished home that was demolished by US NATO bombs and rebel forces. According to one journalist, some areas contained so much rotting corpses that medical workers were forced to wear masks to avoid the stench. As if carpet bombing and physical destruction by rebel forces was not enough, Human Rights Watch has begun an investigation into the mass execution of over 50 Gaddafi supporters who were murdered and left to rot outside a hotel now abandoned that had been occupied by rebel forces. This should come to no surprise, however, after the Independent publicized in August that at Abu Salim Hospital, rebel forces executed dozens of black Africans in their hospital beds, and others were executed with their hands tied behind their backs. It was noted that the rebels eagerly showed the bloody carnage to reporters and admitted that the patients that were murdered specifically because they were black. And if the barbarism of US and NATO and rebel forces is not clear from the crimes to the innocent people around the country of Libya, the recently released video of the brutal torture, sodomizing, and summary execution of Gaddafi by rebel leaders certainly does. As resistance fighters continue to fight the colonization of Libya in Tripoli, it is obvious that despite all the bombs that continue to rain down on the people, and despite the terror campaigns launched to terrorize, murder, and execute every and any person whom stands in the way, the revolutionary spirit of the Libyan people is still in effect, and they stand clearly against US and NATO imperialism and the counter-revolutionary client regime that awaits them. And one of their first acts, the National Transition Council, which is the current de facto government put in place by US and NATO powers, has declared that Sharia law will be the basis for future legislation. Quite the contradiction coming from the US, which on a daily basis uses mainstream media to portray Iran as a threat to the world's security, accusing Ahmadinejad of Islamist fundamentalism. Iran, whose oil also remains off limits to Wall Street, had a very similar regime put in place by the US. The Shah was the head of the monarchy in Iran, and it was one of the most brutal regimes in the history of the country. The Shah was installed after the US CIA overthrew the democratically elected Mossadegh, thus putting the ownership of Iran's oil back into the hands of Wall Street. That is until the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which ousted the Shah for good and put the oil back into the hands of the people. The Sharia law in Libya shows clearly that US and NATO utter lack of interest for human rights, or the people of Libya. Under the NTC's mandate, polygamy, which allows men to take as many wives as they please, has now legally redefined women as second-class citizens. There is simply no doubt that Libya has not been the battleground for democracy and freedom, but the battleground for the international imperialist plunder. Russian revolutionary V.I. Lenin defined imperialism in his work, Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, as, quote, a special stage of capitalism. It is monopoly capitalism, parasitic or decaying capitalism. It is moribund, or in a state of terminal decline capitalism, end quote. He explains that free market competition is inevitably replaced with a system of monopoly, where banks and corporations inevitably take control of all the wealth of society, and in their ever-expanding quest for profit must expand beyond their own borders through imperialist wars and foreign policy. This is the very nature of capitalism, the survival of which requires one of only two actions: the exploitation of market and/or the expansion of markets. So while workers and poor people from the US continue to be laid off, have our homes taken from us, and watch our social services get slashed, we in the US become ever more increasingly exploited. The people of Libya have had their sovereignty stolen from them, and the markets for the super rich open to further their expansion. It is for these reasons that all workers, white, black, brown, gay, straight, men and women, we must stand up and fight back against any and every form of US imperialism. Workers in New York, Wisconsin, Los Angeles, and Oakland must stand up and unite in one struggle, the struggle for socialism. A system where the people's needs are put before the profit of less than 1% of our population. And it is for these reasons that the Party for Socialism and Liberation will continue to stand up and demand an end to US imperialism, from Iraq to Afghanistan, from Palestine to Libya. And it is this reason why the PSL stands in solidarity with the brave people of Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, and Libya that are currently standing up and fighting back against US imperialism. It's this simple, sisters and brothers. If we unite and fight, we can and we will win.